Sorry about the delay, everybody. We're just waiting for one more person for the committee to get quorum. We'll be right with you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Quincy, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and this is the regularly scheduled meeting of the committee. And we're joined by committee members Johnson, Bender, Palmisano. I know Councilmember Yang is unavailable today as he's at a settlement conference for the city, and I'm sure Council Vice President Glidden will be joining us soon. I also wanted to point out that we're joined by Council members Goodman and Reich, as we're going to have the Budget Committee meeting immediately following the Ways and Means Committee. So we just begin today with the 30 items on the Ways and Means consent agenda. The first item is a legal settlement from the City Attorney's Office. We also have a contract amendment with Kirby Kennedy for court reporting. City Coordinator Office brings forward a grant application for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The Convention Center brings forward the bid for messenger construction for Convention Center Exhibit Hall entry fronts and a bid for Huffer Corp. Inc. for Minneapolis Convention Center operable wall partition replacement. Finance and Property Services Department has a contract amendment with Iowa and Associates Corporation for the Fridley Softening Plant. Contract amendment with Morecon Construction for elevator upgrade. Contract for architectural and engineering services with Wald Architects for fire stations 4 and 8 renovations. We have a HUD 2016 consolidated plan final department allocations. This is also a contract with FR Secure Information Security Consulting. Information Technology Department brings forward a contract with Insight Public Sector for ongoing software and workflow support services, as well as a contract amendment with DeltaWorks LLC for continued support services. IGR Department brings forward a contract amendment with Fagri VD Consulting for federal representation services. Public Works Department brings forward another item for the Fridley Filter Plant Rehabilitation Project. This is a license agreement with Anoka County. From the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee, we have the Director's Fee Schedule amendment. We also have a 2015 Tax Increment Finance Report. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee brings forward a grant from Hennepin County for contraception services through the School-Based Clinics Program. Grant for Centers for Disease Control for prevention of teen dating violence and youth violence. Community Wellness Contract Amendments. We also have a joint powers agreement and a memorandum of understanding for youth curfew and truancy services. The Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee brings forward a contract with the University of Minnesota Veterinary Clinic for vet services, MOU for Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. for police officer participation in Presidential Inauguration Task Force. We have travel expense donation acceptance from Major Cities Chiefs Association, the custom door gift acceptance for Aaron Carlson Corporation, security film and labor gift acceptance for C-Bond and Sun Control of Minnesota, grant acceptance from the state of Minnesota 4th Judicial District Court for police liaison and monitoring services, a grant acceptance from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, and a grant acceptance from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, Homeland Security, and Emergency Management Division for the Emergency Management Preparedness Grants. We also postponed from last cycle, we have the Advanced Metering Infrastructure Request for Proposals. That item has gone through the Permanent Review Committee, so that's been approved. So I'm going to put that on the consent agenda for approval. And then the Nicollet Central Modern Streetcar Project. This is for a consulting contract amendment, and rather than passing that in this committee, what we're going to do is return that to the Transportation and Public Works Committee so they can take appropriate actions for its continuation. So with those 30 items on the consent agenda for approval and the number 30 being returned to TPW, any questions or comments? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed, and that items are all carried. That actually concludes the business of the Ways and Means Committee. So I'll have that committee adjourned, and then we're beginning the first of our budget committee hearings. This is the receiving the Mayor's 2017 recommended budget overview presentation, and this will be for the full committee, which is the full council. And this will be an overview presentation of the mayor's recommended budget. It'll include lots of opportunity for questions from committee members. And we'd just like to invite Mr. Ruff up if you'd like to kick it off, kind of outline what we're going to do. I don't know how long exactly you have planned, Mr. Ruff, but I know that there's a number of breaks in the presentation. So if we could kind of hold our questions for the end of a section, we'll be able to answer those questions and then move on to the next one. Feel free to ask those along the way by just waving your hand. Mr. Ruff, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Mark Ruff. I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak before you. As you know, I have been here all of 5 months, and I think speaks well, especially of the staff in the Finance and Property Services division, that they feel confident enough in me that I could be the spokesperson after 5 months. It means that we have very good staff. Latonia Green heads up our budget effort. Really want to say thank you to Latonia and her staff. I also want to especially express my gratitude to the mayor and her staff. As she has told you, she takes this budget process very seriously, and I have seen firsthand. She takes more detailed notes than I do on all of these things, and it's a very impressive process that the city follows. And I also want to say just my gratitude to the departments as well. The presentations that were made before the mayor in all of the departments were very thoughtful, and as you as a budget committee will also have the benefit of those presentations as we move forward in this fall. As Chair Quincy mentioned, we're going to pause after certain major sections of this presentation. I would also say that if there is necessary clarity, or if I skipped over something too quickly in the presentation, because we will be running through some of these slides very quickly, please don't hesitate for me to stop and go back over a slide I may have not sufficiently or adequately described. The highlights the mayor described in her budget address. It is a 5.5% levy increase, and we have to remember that the city's budget overall, including everything being city controlled, is about $1.3 billion. We have other boards and commissions which takes that number over closer to $1.4 billion. Right, so it's a very large budget. The levy is something more than $300 million. So the levy receives an outsized, in my opinion, attention in terms of what drives city revenues and expenses over the long term. Nevertheless, 5.5% levy increase is a number that's slightly higher than what was agreed to by the City Council, agreed to in the sense of what was underlying the agreement with the Parks and Streets earlier this spring. So if you recall, the number that was described at that time was about 4.9% levy increase that was anticipated. Obviously, some of our revenues have changed, some of our expenses have changed. But that was a 1% operating levy increase, as well as $30 million in new capital spending. The 0.5% additional, or 0.6% additional, really is due to a couple of things. One is we are not seeing certain revenues increasing as we expected, and also just the increase in public safety that's associated with the mayor's budget. Because of the attention on the levies, I'll just turn your specific focus into the different components of the levy. As we mentioned, the general fund is a substantial part of the city's overall budget. That portion of the levy is $176 million. The overall levy for 2017 is just under $314 million. The park board is a substantial increase. So in addition to the $3 million of new operating that was associated with the agreement earlier this spring, there is also just the inflation on the park board generally, which goes into that number as well. So you can see the overall levy increase for the park board is $5.4 million. So that's the $3 million plus an additional $2.4 million for inflation and other budgetary costs. Our general bond redemption number is staying the same. That's the overall net debt bond number. You'll say, well, where is the capital cost associated with the streets and the parks? Well, we are issuing bonds this year, but we are not starting to increase the levy until 2018. So when I say this year, I mean 2017 will be the time that we'll incur debt for some of those new improvements. We'll start increasing the levy for those in 2018. and 18. The other of significance, the 595 is just a reallocation of levy. It's not a cut in spending, but the permanent improvement fund is a reduction of $500,000. That's the fund that help underlies many public works and other major projects. It is a revolving fund. We have been working with public works to create a little more discipline in that process. We think we can afford $500,000 less in levy. The pension $5 million drop was again part of the discussion of the parks and streets. We are, because of the good work that was done by this council, previous councils, the amount that we have to pay the state of Minnesota for our closed our pension funds is at least budgeted for this year $5 million less. The rest of the levies remain largely the same, and we will touch on a few of them a little bit later in the presentation. Any questions on the levy?
Not seeing any. Oh, we've got one. Councilmember Goodman.
Asked.
Sure.
I never, this is always new to me, as old as it is. I'm just wondering if you could reiterate. So there's going to be a general fund increase in expenditure of $16 million. What amount of that is for the roads plan?
Largely, the $16 million increase in the general fund is not associated with the parks and the streets. The $3 million increase, which is in the operating budgets, is in the park line item.
Mm-hmm.
The $16 million levy increase, it will be shown later in the context of the whole general fund levy, so it's probably better to answer that question in the general fund budget process rather than just isolating that one function. Because again, the levy in the general fund is only a small component of the overall general fund revenues.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ruff, so where does the spending for roads fall then?
This year, the components of the road funding will be paid for by reduced levy from the pension, so $5 million reduced levy pension.
Okay.
There is cash which is being drawn from other funds. If you recall, there was a discussion of bringing cash in from the convention center fund that will help pay for that. And then there are bond issues which are being issued in 2017, but the debt service on those will not be paid until 2018. So the increased debt service is not in the 2017 budget.
So 100% of the money for roads does not come out of the general fund levy.
For 2017, it will
Right.
come out of the general fund levy in future years.
So there's a breakdown somewhere else in this report of what the $16 million or 10% increase in spending the city is doing. There's going to be a breakdown somewhere else in this presentation?
So there will be a description in the context of the general fund, yes, council member.
Okay, Mr. Chair, because we're saying, okay, we're not spending any more money, except for we're spending 16 million or 10% more in the general fund. So we are spending more money, and to have this assertion that it's all coming for parks and roads is not really true, since the parks and roads portion could have been done without an increase in the levy, it sounds like, at least for next year.
Mr. Ruff, if you could describe the continuing service levels and what the planned increase was anyway.
Right, and Mr. Chair, I think it's better done in the context of the whole general fund presentation,
Okay.
if that's appropriate. I understand the question completely.
And you'll answer it within that part portion.
I will, Councilmember
Thank
Goodman,
you.
yes, thank you.
Anything else? Not seeing anything. Thank you, Mr. Ruff.
So I mentioned the public safety spending. Here is a quick overview of the public safety spending. We will go into greater detail on later slides. But it is both police and fire increased spending. There is also in the mayor's recommended budget $2.7 million in cuts. Primarily that is revolving around healthcare, which is not a cut to services of our employees or healthcare benefits our employees. It's a recognition of what's happened over the last few years in the budget, that we are showing lower usage of the healthcare budget, mainly because we have less family usage and more individual coverage that is used by employees.
Go ahead, Ms. Goodman.
Entire day. So why are we calling it a strategic cut then? It's not a cut, it's a reduction in an expenditure. We're making it sound like, yay, us, we cut something, but this isn't cutting anything. This is just a service reduction. Cost reduction in services,
Mr.
correct?
Chair, Councilmember Goodman, there is $700,000 of department cuts as well. So this was a term that was used in the budget process.
To spin it into looking like we're cutting something. So we're cutting a little bit. 2 million is savings and 700,000 is a reduction in something across every department in the city.
Mr. Chair, Council Member Goodman, there will be reductions in every department's budget associated with the healthcare costs.
Because we're giving them less healthcare, or because the cost to give that same healthcare went down?
Mr. Chair, Council Member Goodman, the latter.
So it's not a cut. Okay, just want to be clear. We're trying to be transparent for people about what the budget is. To say there's a $2.7 million in cuts is not true. There's a $2 million savings and a $700,000 cut across all departments.
Councilmember Quincy, move on. Thank you. General fund. So we talked about the budget generally as $1 billion, just over $1.3 billion. To me, it's easier to parse out the budget into different components. We have the general fund, we have the enterprise funds, we have special revenue funds. So we're going to focus first on the general fund. This chart is just to give a sense of why in part is the levy increasing by 10% for the general fund. And part of that is a function of the fact that if you look 15 years ago, we had state aids which were over 41%. So this chart, the blue at the bottom, are LGA, or local government aid, coming from the state of Minnesota. The gray in the middle is the share of the budget that is the property tax levy, and then the green are other revenues lumped together. So we can see for 2017, the levy is increasing as an overall percentage of the budget from 33 to 35. LGA is flat, and the other revenues are being reduced as well. The general fund is just under $500 million. It's about a third of the total budget. This particular chart helps to answer, I think, Councilmember Goodman's earlier question, which is what's happening with spending overall. Overall, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
I think we had a question from Councilmember Bender, but I was just checking. Council Goodman, did you have a question? Okay, I heard you down there.
Thank you, though.
Okay, Councilmember Bender, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the previous slide, I just think it's important to note here, or sorry, 2 slides back. So when I had a briefing about the budget, the assumption was that there was some uncertainty about our level of local government aid related to the legislature, and it seems like now that question has been answered. So we will not be receiving the extra LGA that would have been included in a tax bill unless there's some special session that happens, very quickly here. And so I think it's maybe important to highlight here that when we passed the budget, in the past we have assumed that there would be more LGA, and now it seems very clear that there won't be that amount of money, so we have to accommodate our budget accordingly. Just didn't want to miss that point.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, you're exactly right. So a breakdown of different revenues that go into the general fund. You can see the first 4 categories are actually decreasing, which is part of the reason we have to increase the tax levy. You can see the overall general fund revenues is up 2%. Part of that is a function of what Councilmember Bender just mentioned, which is our local government aid. We are forecasting at a $100,000 increase. So really nominal. And the rest of the first 4 categories are internal charges, fines and forfeits, which I think we're all happy that they're actually decreasing, but that is a lower revenue source. Franchise fees are essentially the tax we pass along in terms of electric, gas, and some of the cable franchises as well is decreasing. And license and permits, despite the fact that we have a very robust economic activity in the city, is actually going down. For an example, in that category is lane use fees that we charge public and private for blocking parts of the right-of-way. We are seeing a significant decrease in those revenues. So part of this is a function of what has happened in the past, which is we had seen growth in these particular areas of significance. I think there was a discussion in previous budget cycles about this term right-sizing, which is bringing up the revenue expectations for what the historical revenues have been in some of these categories. What we're seeing now is that curve is peaked and starting to come down a little bit. So when you have a budget that needs to increase just basic inflation without any additional types of enhancements to that budget, and we have revenues which are either flat or declining, it's going to put more pressure on the tax levy. Hence, in this case, the two areas where we were able to see more revenue increases are the property taxes and the sales and entertainment taxes. So sales and entertainment tax, we are going to see some benefit coming out of the U.S. Bank Stadium. We do estimate that that benefit will be in the neighborhood of $2 million. During the Parks and Streets, we had talked about at least $1 million, and that was counted on to help pay for some of that cost. But there is certainly the gap that is typically filled is with property taxes. So that's part of what the pressure is. So again, general fund 10%, but overall levy increase 5.5% when we factor in all the other levies that were in the earlier chart. Again, pausing for questions in this particular arena.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you please explain the fund transfers from 4.0 in 2016 to 12.5 in 2017?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Cano, the $4 million is from the parking fund. So the parking fund makes more money than is necessary to just operate the municipal ramps and the parking system. And so historically that has been transferred into the general fund to help write down property taxes. That number was increased from $4 million to $7 million for 2017. So again, as a way of trying to hold down the levy, we did increase the fund transfers. There are also, those last two categories have traditionally funded some capital, in particular the use of fund balance. As the council is aware, we don't like to have structural deficits within our operating budgets. We don't like to use fund balances to help pay for ongoing costs, but in the budget are a significant amount of one-time expenditures, which may be capital, or within this discussion a little later, we'll be talking about some operating that is just one times, meaning that it's only in next year's budget and no promise of future expenditures in 2018 and beyond. So those fund transfers are either half of it is, or more than half of it is the parking, and the other half are help to pay some of the one-time costs. Again, the use of fund balance is a function of the fact that why is that decreasing so significantly? Because even for 2016, we're starting to see those other, especially the first four categories in this area, starting to decline. And that means we're going to have less money left over at the end of the year than we have enjoyed in previous years. Again, it doesn't mean that the economy is necessarily worse in Minneapolis. And in fact, I think most people would say the economy is very good. It's just that we have raised our expectations for what those revenues are going to be compared to previous years.
So, Councilmember Goodman, yes.
I'm wondering about franchise fees being a decrease, given that we added an additional franchisee this year with CenturyLink, for better or for worse. Everyone can have their own opinion about that. Why would we see a reduction in franchise fees then?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, good question. It largely revolves around the fact that we have warmer winters. People are using less energy. We charge a flat rate against the gross revenues of Excel and CenterPoint. And so because we have people using less energy, we have less revenue coming in from that particular source.
That great explanation. So it's not just about CenturyLink and Comcast, it's also about the utilities and their franchise fees. And we could anticipate then further reductions as we move forward on a zero waste initiative and less energy use generally. That would be a reduction in franchise fees too.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, you're absolutely right.
I think that's good. I just want to recognize that's a situation.
Right. Another way to think of the franchise fee, that's passed on to the consumer. So that's a fee that they're not having to pay us that comes back through us. So yes, it's good, in fact, that we are getting less from consumers from that point of view, but it also means we're not over budgeting, and if we anticipated fees coming in higher, that would be a weakness in a budget process as you're forecasting what your revenues you have available for use.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a chart displaying the same information in graphical form for those people who appreciate colors.
It's a pretty wheel.
Moving from the revenue side to the general fund expense side, I think all of you are aware there are just annual increases. I mentioned generally with inflation, we have some new contracts, but we're going to describe for much of the next several slides what these program change items were that were requested to the mayor and the mayor included in her recommended budget. I'm not going to go through every single line item, nor do I want to take away from the importance of the department presentations. In those department presentations moving forward, you'll hear more about the rationale behind each of these, but I want to emphasize that these are ongoing expenses as opposed to the one-time discussion that we had earlier on. There's a separate section that we will talk about one time. But generally, in these categories, increased capacity for assessor, also for the city attorney's office, we do have specific requests from the city clerk on changes on how they keep their records. And then for the city coordinator, we have an existing program which we're enhancing for continuous improvement, as well as citywide events are related to some of the major events, sporting and otherwise, coming forward in the next 3 years in the city. Civil rights has additional staff, 3 FTEs related to some increased expenditures. Communications and finance and property services, this is a dedicated person within our department which will be working specifically on CPED budgets, again, additional FTE. Human resources, one of the bottlenecks, I can speak to this from more direct experience, one of the bottlenecks within staff changes for the city has been the ability to reclassify certain positions. This will add more capacity for that. A variety of programs and 2 FTEs in the health department. Another FTE in the internal audit. And then here's more detail on the police budget as well, in addition to the FTEs, some specifics on non-FTE increases. Two FTEs in traffic management, regulatory services because of some changes in how we receive services for the animal shelter, as well as traffic control. Fire with 5 additional sworn at $400,000. So those were the ongoing expenses. Again, without going into details of the specifics of what those programs are, either myself or Ms. Green can certainly handle some high-level questions if there are any about these positions.
In general, Mr. Ruff, does that equal how much of the 16 million of the new expenditures for the general fund in 17 recommended budget? What are these new positions and enhancements valued at versus the inflationary cost?
It's in the neighborhood of $6.7 million, if my memory is correct, Ms. Green. $6.7 million.
Thank you.
One-time expenses, again, in 311, in 911, and the attorney's office. These are more specific programs oftentimes than FTEs. Obviously, if we hire someone, we usually don't want that to be a temporary employment, although that's not always the case. For city
Councilmember Frey, or is that Goodman? Or oh, okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
City coordinator, again, programs including Clean Energy Partnership and Climate Action Plan. A variety of specific programs. Civil rights, $50,000 for the Earn Sick and Safe Time outreach. We have $200,000 in fire for alternative hiring and recruitment, one time, as well as additional resources for human resources. CPED, a variety of programs, including enhancements to the affordable housing efforts within the city, small business efforts, an increase in funding for regulatory services. Again, you'll see some of these same programs, for example, in reg services for traffic control, which will be both ongoing and one-time. Traffic control here hopefully alleviated after this coming year as construction starts to wind down. Health, a variety of programs, and one FTE within this one-time category. Neighborhood and community relations, 2 new programs, police and public works. One that I want to highlight under administration is there is $500,000 in one time for the Downtown East Commons operating. as well as traffic to accelerate really our replacement of the LED technology, which will save us money in the long run. So with that, those are the one-time expenditures within the mayor's budget, if there are any questions. If not,
Councilmember Goodman has a question.
Same question. What's the total of these one-time expenditures? And is that also a general fund, one-time general fund expenditure?
I think Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, all of these that we have highlighted are general fund expenditures. There are some other non-general fund one-time. They're not significant, but there are some other smaller enterprise funds. This was about $6.5 million, Ms. Green, is it?
7. So
$7
like
million.
13 million in totally new spending between one-time and ongoing.
Yeah, and I think, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, some of those one-time items may have been repeats from 2016. So we have to, when we compare actual increased spending, we have to be careful about that particular term because we have to be apples to apples on that comparison.
But in general terms, is it fair to say something in that range? So of the 16 million of new spending that Councilmember Goodman pointed out in the general fund,
and then I think we have to subtract from that, Mr. Chair, the
$5 of that
$2.7
is-
million in reduced expenses
Right.
as well for operating.
Okay. It helps gain a little perspective on how much is just continuing service level operations, just the inflation factor built in, plus the new enhancements of ongoing, which will be on the levy for future years,
Right.
and these one-time considerations.
Right. So again, on a $500 million general fund budget, those increased operating expenses, or increased program changes, I should say, are the $6.5 million plus the $7 million, right?
Yeah,
Plus
and the
2.7.
great opportunity is, as we get to the department hearings themselves, is when we can really plunge into the details within the department. Councilmember Bender has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So remembering back, you said there was $6.7 million in new ongoing funding, and I'm counting approximately 4.5 million of that in police and fire. Does that sound correct?
That does. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender.
So it seems like the ongoing budget reflects, some small, 2 million of our $1 billion budget in increased ongoing expenditures outside of the police and fire department, and a pretty significant investment of $4.5 million in new ongoing investment in the police and fire department. Does that sound right? Okay, thank you.
General.
I think that's helpful just to get some perspective on where the funding is proposed to be going.
Mr. Chair, just a few minutes on the pension. I just again want to highlight the work that the previous city councils have done.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Yes.
Ruff. Before you start that one, I think Councilmember Johnson has.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious, piggybacking off of Councilmember Goodman's question, the $13 million specifically in increased spending, what percent of the levy increase is that? Of the 5.5 proposed increase, what would that amount to?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I think the short answer is if there are specific questions that in terms of how you want to frame the increase in spending, again, the levy is a small part of the overall general fund budget. And so there are some increases. So whether some of those increased expenditures come from sales tax versus property tax, I just like to not make ties between what revenue sources are and what are expenditures. So I think what we can get back to you if the council has specific questions that are framed in the way that you are asking, instead of me off the top of my head giving you an answer that may be close to what is the right answer. I'd rather have some exactness to that response so it can do it justice. So if we can take your question into consideration and then submit in writing some things that would follow up to the committee, if that's acceptable to you, Mr. Chair.
It's fine with me if it helps you, Councilmember Johnson.
Yeah,
And I
that's
just
fine.
want to make sure Latonia is okay with it. She's the one that's going to have to come up with the answers.
Yes, that's fine with me, Mr. Chair. And I just think that the question is really around understanding, what the spending increases have in terms of an impact on the levy, and if there were to be some changes from the council ultimately, at what different levels would we see the levy increase drop? And so I think that that's
That's
the
pretty,
question I'm wondering about. I'm
$3
not
million.
necessarily concerned about these particular items. I'm just wondering what our menu of options are and ultimately what the impact is at the end of the day for our property taxpayers.
Oh, and Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, maybe I came off sounding too defensive or evasive in that answer. I would just say that if there are choices that you as the council have, so in other words, you could, if you want to reduce spending, you could choose to leave the levy the same place and reduce the sales tax expectation, because you don't want to be in a situation where we are next year, where somehow we didn't quite get to the level of sales tax that we had forecast and we have to reduce. And so that's the more detailed discussion, and why I was suggesting that the levy isn't the only place that we look, because there are such a variety of revenue sources and assumptions. And one conversation that the chair and I had not too long ago was the fact that I think my recommendation to the committee would also be to have a session just on revenues. So as opposed to just focusing on expenditure side of the budget, there are significant assumptions that go into the revenues with this general fund budget, in which we have stronger comfort levels and less comfort levels as to how realistic some of those revenues are. And so you may choose to leave the levy the same and then just have a little bit lower expectation on other revenue source. So it's a more complex discussion, I guess, than just simply the discussion of reducing the levy.
Sure, thank you. And I guess that's, I totally understand that, I guess, for just understanding the numbers or how to think about it in terms of equal values. Let's say for $1 million general fund cut, if we were to find $1 million and able to reduce the general fund levy amount by $1 million, what would we expect the percent increase of the levy to go down by? How much is that worth roughly? I've heard in past years, in 2014, I remember the numbers around that I think was like $800,000 ended up being 0.2% or something like that, roughly. So I'm just curious where that's at today with the current tax capacity, the tax base. What would $1 million be in terms of levy increase and where that's at?
Sure. And
And again, this is all about me understanding and being able to compare prospectively is the rate at which increase is happening.
no, and this, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, will be one area where I'll chalk up to I'm the new guy. And so helping me understand what kinds of questions you're looking for is a great benefit. So the more that you ask those type of questions, the more we're able to give you more choices for you as a council. And so we will certainly get back to you on that particular question.
Okay, I'll expect that offline then. Thank you.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodman.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, it's really not all that complicated. The bottom line is there's $6.7 million of totally new spending, $7 million worth of new one-time spending, and we're having to increase our levy capacity or property tax amount by about $16 million. There are some reasons for that. We're seeing less money in charges for services and fines or fees, but there's no real explanation for why we need $13 million more in spending other than we want it. 2 more lead inspectors, 2 more people here, $100,000 for men's sexual health. Look at some of these items, you guys. So, I mean, if you think the levy is in a good spot and you want to blame it on an increase in service plus the parks and roads thing, that is not correct. There's millions more in totally new spending, whether it being one time or not. Some of it is in police, and I totally support that. I don't want to get into what I wouldn't support of all of these things, but there's a lot more money being spent. And since we're getting less money from other places, we have to get more money from property taxes. It's pretty simple, Mr. Ruff. This isn't like super complicated. You need to get back to us later. There's a whole long list here of things that are new. Some, I don't want to point out what are good and what are bad. There's many good things in here. Some of them, though, are not totally necessary. And to blame the increase on police, loss of LGA, or the Parks and Roads Plan is not true when there's this much new spending in this budget. And you guys can accept that or not, but it's pretty simple.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, to take your approach, which I appreciate. Remember that the one-time is not funded out of the levy. It is funded out of primarily fund balance. So a reduction in the one-time spending will not result under the current mayor's plan and a reduction in the tax levy unless you choose to redirect that fund balance. That is a choice of yours. One that I would not recommend, because then we get into structural imbalances because you are funding operation costs with fund balance, which is not good for the general overall budget health as well as the bond rating. So what we're down to then is the $6.7 million of new spending, which we have to take again, the $2.7 million of reduced cuts. So the net increase is a $4 million increase. The public safety costs associated with the increase is largely $3.7 million of that $4 million. So if that helps in terms of perspective, I think it's important to just lay out what my understanding would be on the impact on the net on the property tax levy if we just isolate that revenue source as the only revenue source under discussion today.
Councilmember Frey, get up. And Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why, just give me a rundown again as to why it's worse to spend one-time items on existing, on other outlets than it would be to simply raise the property taxes. So we've got present items with it that are being funded through one-time items through the one-time items are being funded through the existing balance. Just explain why it's worse to move those items over to existing items.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Frey, it's a healthy discussion. So generally, the short answer is eventually we run out of fund balance.
Right.
And so somewhere down the line, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years, we have to double down on the increases if we're going to continue to have those ongoing expenses be ongoing expenses. Otherwise, we have to start laying people off or cutting programs significantly. I would say it's also not just from the bond rating agencies, but from places like the Government Finance Officers Association, which is a best practice to ascribe capital, which can be termed as one time because you can essentially turn the spigot off on capital if you need to for the most part, and fund those with more fund balance, not universally, but help pay for capital, or some of the other programs that the mayor has put forth and that the council has done in the past. For one time, those are programs which are not associated with as much FTEs, and so it's easier to cut off the spending on those particular programs.
And the money is being spent, though, regardless, whether it's in ongoing or not ongoing, it's being spent.
And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Frey, I think it also has to do with the fact that what are the choices for the use of that fund balance? So I think, so for example, one of the places for the Parks and Streets program that we took fund balance was out of IT or intergovernmental, which funds a lot of the information technology. Some of it came out of the self-insurance fund.
Mm-hmm.
There are competing uses for that money. Part of the reason that we recommended using that last fall is because we had built up enough reserves that we think we could handle the immediate needs. But to the extent that we start taking away more, then you're going to have to find another revenue source for example, tort liability that may occur that self-insurance then can come from.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's kind of fun when we do the budget every year because we get into these kind of big questions. One thing I thought would be helpful is understanding, to your point about the levy. The levy is our capture of our overall tax base from property taxes. So as our tax base grows, if we don't increase the levy, we don't capture that growth, we redistribute it. I think that's one point about the levy. Another point I think is important to remind ourselves annually about the levy is that it compounds over time. So if we keep it lower, like 2 years ago or last year, that has an impact on how much overall funding we have. So we've been spending down fund balance because we kept the levy lower, but now we have less fund balance left to continue to fill that gap. I think of spending fund balance like quitting your job and continuing to pay your mortgage with what you have in your bank account balance, which you can certainly do for how many ever years you have to fund out of your balance. But eventually, to your point, if you're not bringing in revenue, if you're not earning a paycheck, you run out of balance. So I think some of these fundamental things, it's just good to remind ourselves each year as we tackle certainly the debate about how we should spend money. But there's some of these sort of fundamental questions about, again, how does the city bring in revenue? I think it is actually a little bit complicated about how we make assumptions about which revenue we expect to have next year, and so within millions of dollars. Some of these additional spendings are tens of thousands or $100,000, which could easily be covered by changing the assumptions we're making about the revenue that we expect to have in 2017. So I think that there is a little bit of, discretion, certainly a policy decision about how to manage our budget that goes beyond sort of a simple arithmetic calculation. I also wanted to just clarify, so I've just said a lot, you can respond or not. I did want to clarify, since we keep repeating this number 13 million, if that is an accurate number, or if because of the reduction in spending, what's the sort of overall increase in new spending? And I think, again, this distinction between one time and ongoing is important. So that's my question.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, I'd ask Ms. Green just to repeat. So we have $7 million in one-time spending and $6.7 million in ongoing spending. That $6.7 million is offset by $2.7 million in cuts. Okay, so the net is a $4 million increase in ongoing spending, of which the mayor has said is $3.7 million of that is public safety costs. Now, those are round number estimates. The remaining $7 million are one-time expenditures, which are being paid for by either the fact that we expect to have a little bit of money left over, somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 to $5.5 million in better than expected revenues and less than expected expenses, which just drops to the bottom line, and some transfers from other funds to help offset those costs, if that answers your question. Mr. Chair, if we can move on, if there's other questions, happy to address them.
Go ahead.
Budget, again, just want to highlight the fact that there's two budget considerations for pensions. One is the closed plans. That is down to $22.3 million. And then we still have pension liabilities on an annual basis. Both of these funds are in the hands of the state of Minnesota through the PERA and other similar types of state-run investments, and all are accounted for in the recommended budget. So, Mr. Chair, I know that I'll talk a little bit later about our enterprise funds, but I know a big part of this is not only just how much the levy increases, but how does that have an impact on businesses, homeowners, apartment dwellers. So the assessor is not here today. We have some information, but I want to highlight the fact that for 2017, even though we're fairly far along in 2016, there's still some numbers going up and down, and you'll see some numbers in this presentation which are even different than the numbers that were in the book that was published less than 3 weeks ago. So the assessor continues to adjust values based on the market and based on whatever protests that may be out there in terms of taxes, that protests being specifically challenges to values to the assessor's office. I will just highlight the fact that, as reflected in the earlier chart, because of reductions in state aid, we've had to increase the levy substantially over the last 15 years, but those increases throughout the last 5 or 6 years have not been all that substantial. The tax base growth, though, in terms of how we pay for that levy, I will say just one thing about property taxes generally. I've spent most of my career talking about property taxes, and I still dread talking about property taxes because much of the property tax system in Minnesota often certainly number one, increases are not linear, right? There are all sorts of things that cause increases and decreases to not move in the way that we would think. And even when people describe tax base, they can use different terms. There's estimated market value, there's tax capacity, there's adjusted tax capacity. And it also depends on what kind of property. So you can have a homestead piece of property, a home that's applied for homestead that will potentially have taxes increase faster than non-homestead taxes for the same value because of the way state aids and state programs work. So generally, the choice that I have typically used is using estimated market value, EMV. This is the value that is supposed to reflect what is the true sale value of a business or a home. The good news is that generally the city of Minneapolis has a very healthy tax base. We have a $44 billion estimated market value for 2017. All right. We see, at least according to the assessor, new construction contributed of that 44 billion, 0.9 billion. So while we see more in building permits in terms of dollar amounts, we have to remember that a fair amount of the dollar amounts in the building permits are exempt property, so they will not pay property taxes. Property taxes are not included in that estimated market value, or they may be slightly higher or lower than what the actual assessor's market value is. There are also things that happen in the property tax system that are behind the scenes. One of those is a fiscal disparities system. It is a system that I think generally has worked well for the last 40 years. It's a tax-based sharing system so that essentially cities that grow faster or have higher per capita tax-based wealth contribute to a pool, and those with lower per capita tax-based wealth receive some of that benefit. City of Minneapolis received much of that benefit for a long time. Now we are a net contributor to the fiscal disparity system. And so it shaves off some of the benefit of our increase in values, particularly in commercial values. We had rather large increases in commercial values, about 16% a year ago. The fiscal disparity system has lagged, and so we're seeing some of that offset the benefit of the new construction. So what it comes down to is when you have a piece of property that you own or you live in, it's what is that value increase versus what is the city's tax rate, and the tax rate is a function of tax base and your levy. Right? With that, I'm not going to go any deeper, but certainly could answer any question. Generally, we expect the city's tax rate from 16 to 17 to drop slightly, but something under 2% in real amounts. Okay? What's happening in tax capacity, another measurement of tax base? Apartments, this number has been changing over the last several months. At times I've seen this number as high as 18% increase. Lately it's been about 14% increase. Of the 0.9 billion in new value, half of that was apartment value. So over $450 million of new construction value that didn't exist before Pay 2017. So not all apartments are going to see 14% increase in taxes. In reality, almost half of that is attributable to new construction. And so you should see substantial increases in apartments. That's a function of the fact that those buildings are selling quickly and selling at very high values. So we certainly will see a substantial increase in taxes. Again, we don't know how that translates into rents because every apartment owner has to decide how they're going to distribute that tax bill. But again, of the 14%, at least my general estimates are about 6% of that are just attributed to new growth. Residential property, homestead and non-homestead that are less than 4 units, we are seeing something in the 7.5% to 8% range increase in inflation and only nominal amounts of new construction. And the commercial industrial just in that 11 to 12% range.
Mr. Ruff, I think we have a question from Council Vice President Glidden.
So this may be more a question for the city assessor who's here, but I just was taking note of your previous slide where you're talking about the sales of apartment buildings and being at an extremely high rate. I'm just trying to remember your exact language, and I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that, or what exactly is the nature of the trend there, like how high and so forth. Because I know you said part of the increase is due to just the fact that we're also seeing new construction, which is a separate phenomenon.
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Glidden, the Minneapolis is seen as a favorable apartment market for national buyers. And so what we've seen for many cases is that an assessor's base market value on actual sales. And so just I'll use just a hypothetical, is that for a long time, we may have seen apartments selling for something in the neighborhood of $100,000 per unit, and now all of a sudden we see 3 or 4 years later apartments that are selling, especially the new higher end units, like $300,000 a unit. So that's an extreme example, but overall the market has increased. That's due both to top end sales and also to the mid-market sales, existing properties which are changing hands. It's also a function of the fact that people have alternative investments that aren't so great. So you could buy a US Treasury and get 1.5% return, or you could buy an apartment building and get a 4 or 5% return. So those are lower returns than historically have been in the market. And so what we're seeing is apartments are a commodity in the sense that people are investors who buy those commodities. Because the assessor has to base it on actual sales and the state checks what their actual sales are, this is driving up both the cost of the buildings and then eventually the rents, which is what we're seeing, the pressure on affordable housing not being able to stay affordable, because as those new buyers buy the property, they want to see income to match what their sales price is. So it's all a function of a lot of larger market forces, which come back to the fact that apartments are just worth more and are going to be taxed more because they're worth more.
So anyway, thank you. A lot of interesting information in that, including also another piece that I guess I had not realized, is that you were saying this is a favorable market for national buyers. So that says to me also just who is owning these properties is changing. And all right.
On single family, these are again, single family being detached residential. We have seen an increase from 2016 of a median value of 190,500 up to a median value of 205,500. That is still less than the high back in the mid 2000s, but an increase of more than 7.5%. So for 2017 specifically, what's happening with market value on residential properties? This is all residential properties, not just single family. We are seeing a substantial number. Again, this count is just over 100,000. I want to say one thing about this calculation. These are calculations that our office undertakes from data from the county. And so it is an inexact science. This doesn't always account for example, if somebody puts a new porch on their house or has an addition, there might be value increases associated with that. But there was a substantial number, almost 40%, which either decreased or had zero increase in value. And then there are substantial distribution of values. As I said, the median was in the neighborhood, so half less and half more, in that 7.8% range, at least the latest numbers that I had heard from the assessor. Okay. So again, your taxes are a function of what your value is and what the city's rate is. So these are the feels like numbers, I think is the term that has been used in the city in the past, which is given this 5.5% overall levy increase, given what we know today about the tax base, which will be changing. So these are draft numbers. We will see a substantial portion of properties which will see a decrease in city taxes. This is not county and school district taxes. These are only city taxes. Over 40,000 of those 100,000 count. We'll see that decrease. Another 7,000, 8,000 that will see less than a 1%, but also a substantial increase of over 5%.
We have Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. Last year, Council President Johnson had a map in her office that showed the locations where properties had increased the most in value, and that was mainly in the 4th and 5th wards. What kind of analysis do you have with regard to this 2, 3, 4, 5% increase and more than 5% in terms of who it's going to hit the most?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, we don't have that information today. Ms. Green can maybe speak in terms of when we may have a ward by ward analysis.
Ms. Green.
My brain just went dead. Anyway, Chair Quincy, Councilmember Goodman, excuse me, we should be able to have the by ward data as soon as we get the information from the county. We are told that we should get that information this week, so we should be able to do that hopefully in the next week or two.
Good.
And thank you. It'd be great if you could get that information out. I would kind of be led to believe as we're coming out of this kind of recessionary area that parts of town where values have been depressed as a result of foreclosure crisis or being on a tough commercial corridor and that has turned around or changed, they would actually see the greatest increase in value, even if the dollar amount isn't as high.
Yeah.
Like what happened last year where the 4th and 5th wards got hit the hardest. I'm going to guess that we're going to see something quite similar to that again. And everyone should get that information as soon as they can.
Yeah, I agree, Councilmember Goodman, because I think you're right. It is a percentage increase when you have a depressed market during a tough part of the recessionary period. When they're going to come out and rebound, they're going to have a feels like that'll be more significant on their percentage. And I also just wanted to point out, as Mr. Ruff said as he began this segment, this is an inexact. These are estimates driven by the finance department. So that as soon as we have that county data, that'll be more precise, and we'll be able to share that in more consumable format. We have Councilmember Johnson and then Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what's surprising about this is the number of homes that are in the greater than 5% increase. I guess, is that because of new construction and so it's kind of their first time hitting the tax rolls for a lot of homes, or what would be kind of the typical makeup of that 95th percentile of homes that are seeing property tax increases? Is it those depressed markets where we're seeing a turnaround? Is it homes that are in the highest values? Can you kind of break that down, or is it kind of a mix of different homes? And what would be the kind of highest bracket in terms of increase? Because greater than 5%, if I'm adding these up right, if I look at this chart here, it essentially almost looks like 3. If you were to characterize it as decrease or 0, and then 0 to 5%, and then greater than 5%, they'd be almost all equal, it looks like, in terms of the bar sizes. So with those greater than 5%, if you were to continue on there and say, well, what about 5 to 10%? What about 10 to 15%? I mean, is anyone seeing like a 50% increase in property taxes, or is it really in the 5 to 10% range, or can you help characterize the extreme end of the increases?
Right. And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I draw your attention to that previous slide to give you a little more sense. This is, again, value. So our tax rate's going to be lower so that it's not dollar for dollar increase, but you can see over 4,300, more than 20%. I can't tell you because of, again, we're working off of county data that we can't verify as to whether some of those are attributable to new construction or substantial reconstruction. So that data will be available later this fall, certainly before you make your final levy decisions, but it's just not something we have today, nor do we have the breakdown of the market. It goes back to my earlier comment that I think it'd be helpful for the Ways and Means Committee to have a session just with the assessor to answer your exact questions, because I would want to know the same thing if I were in your position. I don't have that information today.
So if you could go back to that slide we were just on, what I would like is if you could further this over on the X scale here and the X axis and show the breakdown, because the fact that greater than 5% is such a tall bar here on this chart, the second tallest, tells me that scale-wise we should have more information available to us because we're kind of just lumping everything together. I'd love to see it go up to 20%, and let's see what it would look like as you showed your property value increase. I'd like to see the distribution of what you estimate. And if it's rough, then we can, you can put them in ranges, but I'd like to better understand that because greater than 5% can mean a lot of things. It could mean an 80% increase in property taxes. I certainly hope that's not the case for anybody out there, but it would be helpful to know by seeing that information, more data in a more useful way. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I would also emphasize is that we would have to show that information for homestead and non-homestead separately, just because, as I mentioned earlier, the tax hits are different depending on the market value exclusion, whether you have the benefit or not.
And I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bender first, and then Councilmember Frey. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to the information requests, I think it is also helpful to provide some context to the percentage increases, in particular to Council or the Chair Quincy's comment. Just understanding the scale of what a percentage increase means based on area values and current rates. So a 5% increase on, in very high value homes is different than a 5% increase on very low value homes, just in terms of the real dollar amounts that people are spending in their property taxes. And I think, not to say that the percentage increase isn't important, but I think it's also important for us to understand the sort of real impacts in real numbers as much as we can get to those estimates. And then I also wanted to just note, I think it's actually more for the assessor's office, but more than 50% of people in the city of Minneapolis rent, and I have a very high percentage in my ward. I've had a concern for the past couple of years that, the assessor's information goes to property owners, not to residents in the case of apartment buildings. And we see rents rising for many reasons, in particular parts of the city, rising property values is contributing to that. And so I just wanted to note that I think it'd be helpful to think of ways that we can better engage with our renters about this issue, and just so that they know, for example, if their a building's assessment has gone up significantly. I heard from a couple of property owners last year whose property value assessment went up significantly, who appealed. But I think that's actually pretty rare, because generally property owners pass on the increases to their renters. And so they get concerned when they start to think that it hits up against their market rents that they can charge. But otherwise, I think we're not probably hearing from property owners, particularly if they're from out of town or wherever. So just a note, and I think, again, it's really more for the assessor's office.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, I can't answer one of your questions, which is for that median $190,500 single-family home in 2016, the city's portion of the taxes was just over $1,100. So if you think a 5% increase then is in the neighborhood of $55 a year, if that helps in your context question.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Frey, did you have something?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, to Councilmember Johnson's point or question regarding whether there were properties that were going up to 50%, the answer is yeah, they do exist, and the highest ones were in North Loop that were 30, 40, and in some cases, I believe 50%. There were several properties that had that increase last year, and I'm expecting that several of those, sadly, will be increasing this year once again. My question was this is page number 26, change in tax capacity for taxes payable in 2017. And so it shows apartments raising at around a 15% rate. So just because there's a change in tax capacity doesn't necessarily mean there's an increase in the taxes that were being levied. So what exactly is this chart showing?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Frey, it's just trying to give you a sense of what the increases are on a percentage basis of the different components of the city's overall tax base.
Does this mean, though, that apartments are rising in the tax rate at 15% or 14%?
Right. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Frey, the answer is no.
Okay.
And again, the apartments are a special case because there's so much new construction that's driving the overall tax base of apartments, is that you should see on average the apartments increasing. My estimate overall was about 8% overall. But again, it will vary from apartment building to apartment building, probably even on a greater scale than what you see in homes. In other words, newer buildings will probably be accelerating more than older buildings will. But certainly if that's a question for the assessor we can bring back, we would be happy to have him address that.
So maybe I'm just confused about this chart. The chart is titled Change in Tax Capacity for Taxes Payable.
Right.
Is this showing just an increased tax capacity regardless of what is ultimately levied?
So, Mr. Chair, you're asking a good question. I'm not explaining it very well. Yeah. So let me see if I can take a different tact and give you a sense. So just for a relative scale, out of that $44 billion of value that we have, and I'm going to move away from tax capacity and just talk about general estimated market value. Apartments are about 7.2 of that 44 billion. Okay, so that 7.2 is going up by about 14%.
So it's 7.2 billion of the 44%.
Of the 44%.
So the 7.2. Okay, so the 7.2 is the amount that we will actually be levying, though.
No, the 7.2 is just what, when you add all the apartments up in the city,
That's the
their
value.
combined market value. And so as we look at it then, that's a 14% increase in combined market value of all apartments compared to last year. So we're just trying to show that the fact that, we talk about within single family homes, the fact that taxes are going up, you're probably going to see a more significant amount of taxes going up for apartments, but that's both a function of new construction and existing value.
Okay, so that's a percentage of, so when you say tax capacity, we're not talking about tax capacity in the legal sense.
We are not.
Okay.
We are talking specifically about a term that the state of Minnesota gives us on how we levy our taxes against tax capacity, which is a function of market value.
Okay, so if on this chart, if you're saying that if the apartments are increasing by 14%, that could simply be a function of having more apartments in the city.
Correct.
But the tax capacity remains at the general residential tax capacity of whatever it is, several percentage points.
On an individual basis, it will vary. And as I said, for single family properties, there's very little new construction, so we don't have to factor out new construction.
Okay, so if that's helpful to know.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then if on slide 29, which excludes apartments from this calculation, it would be really helpful to see what their increases are, because those are inevitably passed on to the renter from the apartment owner. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
So we don't, and there's nowhere in here that actually has, I mean, the apartments are a significant portion, I mean, they're a gigantic portion of my.
And Chair Quincy, Councilmember Frey, the same would apply in getting back to you on the same information for non-apartment residential. We will do our best to get from the county apartments and factor out all of the new construction associated with apartments, so you can just see for an existing piece of property, what's the tax increase on average. So it's a fair question.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I know we're running long on time. I'm just going to try to highlight a few of the other things that are important to the city, and I do want to not underemphasize the importance, especially on enterprise funds, special revenue funds, and internal service funds. So enterprise funds, I'm going to talk specifically about parking quickly, just to give you a sense of where the parking fund is at, and then also for the other enterprise funds in terms of the overall bill that residents will be seeing. The parking fund is healthy, as I mentioned. We have transfers out not just to the general fund, but also to the Target Center. That's been historical. Those are $11 million. We are seeing modest increases in operating revenues and some 5.4% increase in expenses. We also have a little bit of debt being issued next year, but overall the debt is very small for the municipal parking enterprise. Combined utility bill, I think this number is important from the perspective of if we add up the water, sanitary sewer, stormwater, and solid waste and recycling. Public Works is anticipating a 3.8% combined average increase in the monthly bill. But I would submit to you as council that if you look at what the median taxes are that I mentioned, we're just under $1,100 per year for city taxes, and we look at what the average 2017 annual bill for these combined utilities are about the same. So in other words, enterprise funds are an important part of the city's both revenue source and actually what homeowners then and renters and businesses pay on a monthly basis as well. These are partly functions of the fact that we have the Met Council we have to make payments to on sanitary sewer, the fact that we're issuing new debt and paying for improvements to our filtration plant up in Fridley. And we are also seeing some increases in stormwater. If you remember, a part of the streets and parks funding was additional funding from stormwater to pay for the curb and gutter. And so that's largely the response, or why we're seeing a 3.5% increase in stormwater fees being proposed by Public Works. You again will hear more from them on the details of these bills. But the 3.8% overall 2017 change is what is proposed.
Mr. Ruff, when does the Met Council fees, are they set? Is the sanitary sewer a known at this point?
Mr. Chair, Met Council has made improvements on their forewarning, so yes, we do know what the Met Council fee increases will be for 2017.
Okay, thank you.
These slides are just summaries of operating budgets excluding capital. You will hear more about capital later, but overall, it's not the operating costs that are driving the increases. It is other factors related to capital. These are breakdowns in terms of the individual and the 5-year plans. So a good thing about Public Works, as well as the general fund that we do a 5-year financial direction. Also, Public Works tries to forecast those overall increases over a longer period of time and try to smooth out those increases as well. As a business enterprise, certainly seeing spikes is not a good thing. You'll see stormwater. There are major capital improvements, but there's also cash balances to help offset some of those major capital improvements. And then the water fees, again, it's a large base. I would also say, remember, it's not just a function of what the operating and capital, but also this is an area where we are seeing people use less water. And so that has an impact on what our rates need to be in order to support our enterprises, because our operating costs and capital costs do not decrease equal to what the usage is. Special revenue funds. The major special revenue fund is the Convention Center. This is operating and expense of $18 million of operating revenue. Expense is about $26.8 million. So there is a transfer to from the general fund to the Convention Center, the special revenue fund. It pays for debt service. It also pays for capital improvements. In the $20 million is, if you're aware, $10.5 million for plaza improvements that are proposed for the Convention Center, and then another $9.5 million, which is just the historically, we've had to put somewhere between $9 and $13 million to keep that building viable and competitive. And certainly Mr. Johnson can describe that in his presentation as well. One of the other one-time items that is being proposed out of the Convention Center cash balance are $1 million increase to Meet Minneapolis related to marketing and large events. And we also have one new FTE within the Convention Center.
Mr. Ruff, I think we have a question from, did you have a question, Councilmember Gordon?
I did, thank you very much. So I'm wondering what the debt service is through 2019, and if that total transfer is just for debt service, or is that to cover the operating expectations as well? There's a gap there between operating expense and operating revenue. So is the 49.8 to pay for everything on that page, or just some of the things?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Reich, the 49.8 is to pay for the difference between operating revenue and expenses. It is to pay for the capital, and it is also to pay for debt service. My recollection was there was around $24 to $25 million a year in debt service, but Ms. Green can look up the financial plan and correct me on that number if I'm not close to my memory being on target.
I think there was one thing in the mayor's budget. I think it's a $10 million improvement for the park outside the convention center, and it said, I believe, in the budget that was coming from convention center money.
Correct.
So is that money that the convention center has been saving, but was also coming from the general fund first before it became convention center money?
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, historically, if you recall, up until a few years ago, the hospitality taxes, the sales and hospitality went directly to the convention center fund, and so part of the buildup of that cash balance was related to hospitality taxes that has now transferred to the general fund, and then you make a transfer out of the general fund to support the efforts of the convention center. I was right. The debt service is $24 million a year. And so it is the plaza improvements and the Meet Minneapolis and the operational difference between revenues and expenses all come out of the general fund transfer of $49.8 million. That's about the number we've been at historically the last couple of years. It's actually maybe a little bit less than last year's transfer as well.
Okay, thank you.
We also have special revenue funds related to community development block grants. I'll move through that quickly unless there are questions, as well as some variety of smaller special revenue funds. One note that I want to highlight is the city was awarded this grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. So the budget does include a new FTE related to Rockefeller Foundation Chief Resiliency Officer within the city coordinator's office. A few internal service funds. We do have most of our IT, our information technology, run through the Intergovernmental Services Fund. We've had high expenses in 2016 with the implementation of the ELMS project. We do expect some more stabilization in those expenses beginning in 2017 and going on to 2018. We do have a new FTE within the Intergovernmental Services Fund for a business analyst to help with the capacity of the IT department. Self-insurance funds primarily are tort obligations as well as workman's comp and some sick time accumulation. Good news, as I mentioned, lower tort expenses in 2016 than has historically been the case, but we are seeing increases in workman's comp claims as well, so that's offsetting that. But generally, we see about the same amount of revenues. We will be seeing an actuarial study in 2017, which will give us a better sense of the necessary cash balance within that particular fund. Fleet services expenditures down by $1.2 million. And property services, we're also seeing a decrease. One important factor within the property services fund is we do have $1 million for beginning the downtown campus study, as the council had authorized our department to go out for a request for proposals for consultants to start on owner's representative and pre-design program development, and we have started on that process as
Mr.
well.
Ruff, could you go back now
Sure.
2 slides, and Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't imagine that it's in the self-insurance fund per se, but can you explain a little bit as to where we hold all of the accumulated vacation time and sick time that our employees hold? Because I know that we are looking at that in the city coordinator's office to see how we might look to amend that to make a little bit more sense for our employees and for the amount of money we have to hold for those line items.
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, my understanding is the accumulated sick time resides within the self-insurance fund. The vacation time, I do not believe resides within that fund, but I'm looking to Ms. Green if she has other information on that.
Ms. Green?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Palmisano, the accumulated time is retained in the self-insurance fund, and the vacation payout, normally departments have to pay for that out of their budgets.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm just looking at the description. This is in the book that was printed on page E67 is a description in the self-insurance fund. So there is more information in E66 and E67 about those particular topics. I won't take the committee's time today on that.
Councilmember Bender. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry if I missed the earlier clarification of this. Why is something like the proposed spending of the convention center or plaza not in the capital budget? I remember when it came through CLIC as part of that process. So it did go through that sort of capital budgeting process like all of our other capital projects. So why is it here? Is it the revenue source or what?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, as I understand it from the convention center, historically the convention center capital improvements have not run through CLIC. It is because they fund them largely themselves and they are not funded with bond issues. Now CLIC has, obviously within CLIC are some non-bond capital improvements as well. I think, as I understand it, the convention center was given the recommendation to go through CLIC this year because gave more options for the mayor and the council to decide if you wanted to use bonds for that particular major capital improvement, since it's larger than what they have typically done. But the short answer is, historically, Convention Center has not run through Click and has just funded itself for those capital improvements.
And then I think this was the part that you already answered, but what does it mean when you say they've funded it themselves? Via what revenue source?
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, maybe I'm ascribing some, that's interpreted as a pejorative statement. I don't mean it by that mean. It just means that they have, because it's a special revenue fund, it's not considered to be part of the general fund and the regular operations. And so there is an accounting difference for those types of operations. Certainly, the mayor and the council have within your authority the ability to allocate those funds however you want to. Just one small item, which is public. We do pay attention to very important small things in the city, and this is a good example. I actually took a tour of the Royalston Maintenance Facility, where we are putting a new public works stores where we try to keep inventory down. And so there is a part of the internal service fund in which we are adding 2 FTEs to make that a more efficient operation. And I physically was able to see that on a tour, and just want to commend the folks in Royalston for taking on efforts to improve just the small things of the operations of the city. Capital, I'm only going to touch on briefly, and you'll certainly have much more from Mr. Abelin and Public Works on this topic later, when Public Works has more detail on their capital budgets and the specific projects in 2017. A couple of pieces of good news. One is our debt service generally at 10% of the total budget is relatively small when you compare it to other like entities. Our infrastructure we see is over about $200 million in 2017. Again, looking at it over 5 years, it's about $900 million. The other good work that was done historically is reducing the liabilities for the libraries. This year, 2017, will be the last year of operating subsidy to the county, and then after that, the city will no longer have an operating subsidy. The $9.3 million in debt, the market value referendum debt, is related to the library bonds. We are now getting an additional state aid that we are forecasting in November, about $3.7 million. That will shorten the term of those bonds, and we expect hopefully to pay off those bonds if that state aid remains over the term in 2021 or 2022. Here's a brief overview of...
I'm sorry, Mr. Ruff. Councilmember Palmisano?
Mr. Chair, and this is a question for Mr. Ruff. How does the obligation that we'll be paying to Hennepin County for the library system in 2017 compared to what we were paying this year in 2016? Do you recall? Because I thought it was substantially less.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, I'll have to look to Ms. Green on what our historical contributions have been to the operating for the library.
Ms. Green?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Palmisano, in 2016, it was like $1.5 million, and then it was like it was declining on a double basis, double decline. But this is the final year of that payment.
So just to clarify, we're paying $1.5 million this year and likely $0.8 million next year.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, that's correct.
Okay, thanks.
This is a breakdown of the debt that I described, just under $200 million, and how it compares to 2016 in different categories. Generally, we have seen a significant decrease in the bonded indebtedness since 2004. It's dropped by almost half. That number will be increasing over time as we make more investments in our streets and our parks and in the public utilities as well. CARS, which is the essentially equipment replacement system. We did go through another process, another round of requests and allocations. The recommendation is $16 million funded in 2017. Of that, $4.4 million comes out of the general fund. And here is a breakdown of those CARS recommended funding by department. Again, you will hear about those specific requests in the department presentations. So overall, we talked about the $1.3 billion. The new information here is just to talk about how many positions is related to the overall budget. It is an increase of 148 positions. That's not just general fund, but all special revenue funds, as well as internal service funds and the general fund. Salary and wages, we see increase to 311 million from 292 million. The benefits decrease we have already talked about, related to the health insurance lower expenditures. This is a historical on full-time equivalent for the city. And just
Mr.
a
Ruff?
breakdown of the different, by major types, the $1.3 billion in broad categories.
Mr. Ruff, I think
Yes.
maybe back a slide or two. I'm looking at Councilmember Gordon. Was that on FTEs?
Yes, but I was actually looking at page 55, so the previous slide, or maybe the one before that. You went over the 148 positions from 2016, and that's always an interesting point for all of us. And you mentioned they weren't all from the general fund. Do we know how many of those are from the general fund, or how many are, I'm assuming the ones that aren't the general fund are some special grants that we have? I know there's some significant grants from the federal government and elsewhere. You think it's half?
Mr. Chair, again, I'd ask Ms. Green to comment on that particular question from Councilmember Gordon.
Ms. Green?
Chair Quincy, Councilmember Gordon, I actually have that information, but I need to open it up to be able to give you that information. And if you just bear with me a moment and let Mr. Ruff continue, then I'll be able to give you that number. But I would add that most of the increase of 148 positions was in the capital section. It had about 89 positions that was from capital. That number I remember, I just don't remember which portion was general fund and non-general fund.
Okay, thank you. And if you can send me the information after the meeting too, if you find it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
For those who like a lot of detail on charts, we've put in each department within the major functions of the overall budget. The sources of revenue in the overall budget as well. Next steps as far as the budget process. Highlighted here are the BET, the Board of Estimate and Taxation meeting on September 14th. Then we begin the budget presentations by each department. There's a website link if anyone wants to see when each department will be making those presentations. City does need to have a maximum levy by September 30th. We do anticipate then the homeowners, businesses, renters receiving their notices in November, for those renters who actually receive the notices, as Councilmember Bender pointed out. And then public comments November 30th, budget markup December 2nd, and budget adoption on December 7th. With that, Mr. Chair, I appreciate your patience, your willingness for questions, and sometimes my hesitation on those answers. But again, I just want to reemphasize the city is in very good financial health. You all as a council deserve great credit for building a solid foundation, and certainly from being the chief financial officer coming into the city, I really couldn't be happier in terms of the work that's been done here in the past, and just the professionalism of all individuals involved in this, and appreciate very much the opportunity to be here.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. The overview is a very helpful first step in our process. I do want to take this time and thank Ms. Green and the entire Finance Property Services team for putting the budget book together and getting it to us very quickly this year. So much appreciated. Allows us a lot of time to digest this information, and this overview sets us up well for the next steps, which are the department hearings. The certified proposed maximum levy is due by September 30th. That's a function of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And that process begins on September 14th. And our budget committee presentations begins on September 22nd at 9:30. So as you said, the schedule is available there on the Finance, on the Budget Committee website, and should have a fun fall. Thanks so much, Mr. Ruff. I have a final comment from Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it makes sense for staff to present the next year's budget during these presentations, but I just wanted to remind myself that the assumptions about our levy and other assumptions about revenues are part of a 5-year financial projection. And so I just want to remember that if we talk about making changes to this year's assumptions, that it doesn't have an impact just on 2017, but rather over the next 5 years and beyond. And I think we've seen the consequences, for example, of the levy cut that happened before this council took office, which is what it is, but it resulted in higher levy increases for the same amount of spending than would have otherwise been seen if that cut hadn't been taken place in whatever 2013 it was, I think, that the vote was taken. And so just to remind everyone and myself as well that each year is important, and certainly the spending decisions about each year are very important. I look forward to that discussion and debate, but the longer term picture is also part of this, what you've presented today that wasn't reflected in the information here.
Not seeing any other comments. Thank you all very much for this. We'll see you next time.
Second? Hi.